The fire didn't just consume the wood in the hearth, it ate a man's life in a matter of seconds. Donna Adelaide watched the parchment curl and blacken, her face as cold as the marble floor of the big house. That paper was the only thing standing between Bento and a lifetime of chains. It was his manumission, signed and sealed by the colonel before his breath left him. But with a single flick of her wrist, the widow turned that freedom into ash. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just watched the blue flames dance over the ink until the name Bento disappeared forever. What she didn't realize was that some debts are written in places that fire can't reach. And the colonel, a man who knew his wife's greed better than he knew his own prayers, had already placed a trap right under her nose. The Fazenda Tres Barras was a kingdom built on coffee and sweat. It was a place where the air always smelled of roasted beans and damp earth, a place where the sun felt like a whip on your neck from dawn until dusk. Colonel Custodio had run this place with an iron hand for 40 years, but Bento had been his shadow for 30 of them. Bento wasn't just a stableman. He was the man who knew the colonel's secrets, the man who had pulled him from a stampeding horse twice, and the man who had learned to read by candlelight while the rest of the house slept. He was the most loyal soul on the plantation, and everyone knew it. They also knew that the colonel had promised him his freedom on his deathbed. But the colonel was barely cold in his grave when the wind changed. The big house, with its white pillars and sprawling porches, was suddenly a cage. Donna Adelaide didn't see a loyal servant when she looked at Bento. She saw a piece of property. She saw a high-value asset that could be sold to cover the mountain of gambling debts her husband had left behind. You see, the colonel had a weakness for the tables in the city, and the accounts at Tres Barras were bleeding red. Adelaide was desperate. She needed every head, every hand, and every horse to keep the creditors from her door. Reparaniso. Some people call this tradition, but it's just cruelty with a fancy name and an expensive dress. The morning of the will reading was grey and heavy. The rain was threatening to pour, turning the red dust of the yard into a thick, sucking mud. The living room of the mansion was packed with relatives, lawyers, and the local elite, all smelling of lavender water and old cigars. Bento stood at the very back near the door, his head bowed but his ears sharp. He expected to hear his name. He expected the lawyer to read the words that would let him walk off that land a free man. Instead, the room went silent when the lawyer reached the final clause. Donna Adelaide leaned forward, a thin, predatory smile touching her lips. The lawyer cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. He read the words slowly. The colonel hadn't left Bento his freedom. He hadn't left him a small plot of land or a bag of silver. He had left him a single item, a moth-eaten heavy wool coat. It was an old thing, stained with years of grease and dust, something the colonel used to wear in the stables on the coldest nights of the year. A ripple of laughter went through the room. It started with Adelaide and spread like a sickness. A coat. 30 years of saving the master's life, 30 years of loyalty, and all he got was a rag that even a beggar would think twice about picking up. Adelaide stood up, her silk dress rustling like a snake in the grass. She walked over to where the coat lay on a side table, picked it up with 2 fingers as if it were a dead rat, and threw it at Bento's feet. "There is your inheritance," she spat, her voice dripping with mock pity. "The colonel clearly thought you were shivering. Now take that trash and get to the fields. You're no longer the master of horses, Bento. You're just another hand in the coffee groves. And if I see you near the stables again, Norberto will have something much sharper than a needle to show you." Bento didn't move for a long moment. He looked at the coat lying in the dirt by his boots. It was heavy, unusually heavy for such a worn-out garment. He felt the eyes of the entire room on him, some with pity, most with derision. Norberto, the head overseer, was already standing by the door, his hand resting on the handle of his whip, waiting for the signal to drag Bento away. Norberto was a man who enjoyed his work a little too much. He had been waiting years to get his hands on Bento, jealous of the favor the old colonel had always shown him. Bento reached down and picked up the coat. The wool was rough and smelled of cedar and old tobacco. As his fingers closed around the collar, he felt a strange stiffness in the hem. It wasn't just old fabric. There was something inside, but he kept his face a mask of stone. He didn't look at Adelaide. He didn't look at the lawyer. He just draped the coat over his arm and walked out into the rain. The problem was that Adelaide's greed had blinded her to a very simple fact. The colonel wasn't a fool. He knew his wife would burn any paper she found in his desk. He knew she would try to sell Bento the moment his heart stopped beating, so he had spent his final weeks doing something no one expected. He had spent hours in the quiet of the night, sitting by the fire with a needle and thread, working on that old coat while the household slept. Bento walked toward the slave quarters, the rain starting to soak into the heavy wool. Every step he took felt like he was walking into a trap. He could hear Norberto's heavy boots behind him, splashing through the mud. The overseer wasn't going to let him go easily. He wanted to break Bento, to show everyone that the special treatment was over. "Hey, horse whisperer," Norberto shouted, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "Stop right there. That coat, it's too good for a field hand. Maybe I should take a look at it. Might be some lice in there I need to beat out." Bento didn't stop. He knew that if he let Norberto touch the coat now, it was all over. He could feel the weight shifting in the lining, a solid rectangular shape that didn't belong in a garment. It was a document. He knew it, but he needed time to see it, to read it, and to figure out how to get it to the only man in the valley who couldn't be bought by Adelaide's fading prestige, Judge Mirels. The overseer caught up to him near the edge of the coffee groves, grabbing Bento by the shoulder and spinning him around. The mud splashed up onto the hem of the coat. Norberto's face was twisted in a grin, his teeth yellow and broken. He reached for the lapel of the coat, his eyes narrowing as he felt the unusual weight. "What you got in here, old man?" Norberto hissed. "You steal something from the big house before you left? Some silver spoons? A watch?" "It's my inheritance, Norberto," Bento said, his voice low and steady. "The mistress gave it to me in front of the whole town. You want to call her a liar?" Norberto hesitated for a split second. He didn't care about the mistress, but he cared about the law of the plantation. If she had given it to him, taking it might look like a challenge to her authority. But the weight, it was wrong. He gripped the wool tighter, his fingers brushing against a large, scratched brass button on the chest. "I don't care what she gave you," Norberto said, pulling his whip from his belt. "I say it's stolen. Give it here, or I'll peel the skin off your back right here in the mud." Bento looked around. They were alone at the edge of the groves. The other workers were already deep in the trees, their heads down, trying to stay out of the crossfire. The rain was coming down harder now, blurring the world into shades of grey and brown. Bento knew he couldn't win a fight against a man 20 years younger and armed with a whip, but he also knew that if he gave up the coat, he was signing his own death warrant. But what Norberto didn't know was that Bento had spent 30 years learning the layout of this land better than the colonel himself. He knew where the old drainage tunnels were. He knew which parts of the forest were too thick for a horse to follow. And he knew that the heavy brass button Norberto was touching wasn't just a fastener. As the overseer lunged forward, Bento did something no one at Tres Barras had ever seen him do. He didn't cower. He didn't beg. He swung the heavy, wet coat like a flail, the weight in the hem catching Norberto right across the temple. The sound was like a branch snapping. The overseer crumpled into the mud, his whip falling uselessly into a puddle. Bento didn't wait to see if he was breathing. He turned and ran. He didn't run toward the quarters. He ran toward the Ribeirão do Ferro, the deep, fast-moving river that marked the edge of the colonel's property. He had to get out. He had to get to the village. But he could already hear the bells ringing back at the big house. The alarm was being raised. Adelaide was standing on the porch watching the rain when she heard the shout. She saw Norberto being carried back toward the house, his face a mask of blood. Her eyes turned toward the dark line of the forest where Bento had disappeared. She didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, burning rage. "Get the dogs," she whispered to the remaining guards. "I want him back, and I want that coat. There's something he's carrying, something he thinks is his. Bring him to me in pieces if you have to, but don't let him reach the road." What she didn't know was that the secret hidden in that moth-eaten wool was already starting to unravel her life. The colonel hadn't just left Bento a coat, he had left him a key to a door Adelaide didn't even know existed, and as Bento pushed through the thorns and the mud, clutching the wet wool to his chest, he felt the brass button click under his thumb. It wasn't broken, it was a toggle, and when he twisted it, the lining of the coat began to give way, revealing the crisp, dry edge of a document that would change everything. The race had begun, and the prize wasn't just freedom. It was the very ground they were standing on. But the river was rising, and the dogs were already catching the scent of wet wool and fear. Bento reached the bank of the Ribeirão do Ferro, the water a churning mess of brown foam and broken branches. There was no bridge for miles, only the old stone pillars of a crossing that had washed away years ago. He looked back. The torches were flickering through the trees. They were coming. He looked at the coat. He looked at the water. If he jumped, the document might be ruined. If he stayed, he would be killed. The weight of the inheritance was suddenly a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. But then he remembered the sound of his manumission papers crinkling in the fire. He remembered the look on Adelaide's face when she laughed at him. He didn't just have a coat. He had the truth, and the truth was about to get very, very expensive for the widow of Tres Barras. The Ribeirão do Ferro didn't care about justice. It only cared about gravity and the heavy rains that had turned its usual gentle flow into a thundering wall of mud and broken timber. Bento stood on the slippery bank, the breath coming in ragged gasps that burned his lungs. Behind him, the baying of the hounds was getting louder, a jagged sound that tore through the rhythm of the rain. Norberto's men weren't far behind. They were fueled by the widow's promise of a gold coin for whoever brought Bento back, dead or alive. Bento looked at the water. If he jumped, the current would try to drag him under. If he stayed, the whip and the noose were waiting. But his biggest worry wasn't his own skin. It was the coat. The heavy wool was already drinking the rain, becoming a leaden weight on his shoulders. If that document inside got soaked, if the ink ran and the seal dissolved, he'd just be another runaway slave with a stolen rag. He needed a way across that kept the lining dry. He spotted the remains of the old stone bridge. Only the central pillar and a few jagged beams remained, ghosts of a path that had been abandoned years ago. It was a suicide mission, but the dogs were close enough now that he could hear the snap of branches under their paws. Bento stripped off his worn leather shoes, burying his toes into the freezing mud for grip. He tied the sleeves of the coat tightly around his neck, tucking the bulk of it high against his chest right under his chin. He climbed onto the first stone ledge. The rock was slick with moss and slime. Below him, the river hissed like 1,000 snakes. One slip and the Ribeirão would swallow him whole. He crawled along a rotted timber beam, his fingers bleeding as he gripped the splinters. Halfway across, a dog broke through the brush on the bank he had just left, a massive, scarred beast with red eyes. It lunged, its teeth snapping just inches from Bento's heel before it tumbled into the water, swept away in an instant. Bento didn't look back. He reached the central pillar, his muscles screaming. He leapt the final gap to the far bank, landing hard on his shoulder. He tumbled down the embankment, thorns tearing at his face, until he hit the bottom of a shallow ravine. He was alive. He was across, but he was shivering so hard his teeth rattled like dice in a cup. He crawled under a low rock overhang, a small cave barely deep enough to shield him from the downpour. His hands were shaking as he untied the coat. He had to know. He had to see if the colonel's last joke was real or just a dying man's delirium. He felt the lining. It was damp on the outside, but the inner layers, protected by the density of the wool and the way he'd held it, felt dry. He traced his fingers over the chest of the coat until he found it. The large brass button. It was old, tarnished, and had a deep, jagged scratch across its face, a mark he'd seen the colonel make with a file weeks before he passed. At the time, Bento had thought the old man was losing his mind, fiddling with a coat in the middle of the night. Now he understood. Bento gripped the button. It didn't just sit there. It felt loose, yet anchored to something solid inside the fabric. He twisted it to the right. Nothing. He pushed it in and twisted it to the left. A small metallic click echoed in the silence of the cave. The heavy seam along the interior of the ribs suddenly loosened. He reached inside the double lining. His fingers touched parchment. Not just any paper, thick, high-quality vellum that crinkled with the sound of authority. He pulled it out slowly. There were 2 documents. The first was a deed, notarized and stamped with the imperial seal. It described a piece of land known as Porto do Ferro, the very ground where the plantation's main coffee warehouses sat, the strategic point where every bag of beans had to pass to get to the city. The name on the deed wasn't Colonel Custodio. It wasn't Donna Adelaide. It was Bento. The second paper was a letter written in the Colonel's shaky final handwriting. To whoever tries to steal what is not theirs, it began. The Colonel had known. He had known that Adelaide had been siphoning money, that she had been working with creditors behind his back, and that she would show no mercy to the people who had built his wealth. He had bought the most valuable part of the estate in Bento's name years ago, hiding the transaction in a web of legal technicalities that only a judge could untangle. Bento sat in the dark, the weight of the discovery hitting him harder than the river's current. He wasn't just a free man. He was the owner of the very heart of the Tres Barras Empire. If he could reach the village, if he could show this to Judge Morels, Adelaide wouldn't just lose her servant, she would lose her house, her land, and her status. But the victory felt cold. He looked at his scarred, muddy hands. For 50 years, he had been a shadow. Now, he was a target. Back at the big house, the atmosphere was shifting from anger to something closer to panic. Donna Adelaide paced the length of the study, the heels of her shoes clicking like a clock counting down. The lawyer, a man named Dr. Arana, sat at the desk, his face pale as he looked over the plantation's ledgers. "The creditors will be here by sunset tomorrow, Adelaide," Arana whispered. "If you don't have the contracts for the warehouse lands signed and ready, they will seize the mansion. You told me the Colonel left those papers in the safe." "The safe was empty," Adelaide screamed, slamming her hand onto the desk. "He hid them. That old man spent his last days hiding everything from me. And that slave, that horse groomer, he took that coat like it was a holy relic. Why would he fight Norberto over a rag?" She stopped pacing. Her eyes widened as a terrifying thought took root. She remembered the Colonel's sewing. She remembered the way he had insisted with his last breath, that Bento receive that specific coat. "The coat," she breathed, her voice turning into a hiss. "It's in the coat." She didn't wait for the lawyer to respond. She ran to the door, screaming for the remaining guards. She didn't just want Bento caught anymore. She needed that coat back before he realized what he was carrying. She knew the law. If Bento reached the judge with a legal deed in his hand, his status as a slave wouldn't matter. The property law of the Empire was absolute. "Find him!" she shrieked into the rainy night. "Tell Norberto I don't care if he's dead. Just bring me that coat. If he reaches the village, you're all headed for the gallows with him." Bento, huddled in his small stone cave, heard the distant tolling of the plantation bell. It wasn't the call for work. It was the call for a manhunt. He tucked the papers back into the lining, clicked the brass button shut, and stood up. His shoes were gone, his feet were bleeding, and the village was 10 miles of treacherous forest away. But as he stepped back out into the rain, he didn't feel like a victim. He felt the weight of the coat on his shoulders, and for the first time in his life it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like armor. The problem was, Norberto had lived his whole life in these woods too, and while Bento was crossing the river, the overseer had already figured out where the old man would have to go to find a dry path to the village. At the old stone bridge, Norberto stood over the body of his drowned dog, his eyes fixed on the muddy tracks on the far bank. He wiped the blood from his temple and pulled a long serrated knife from his belt. "You're a smart one, Bento," Norberto whispered to the wind, "but even a king can't run without his feet. A man's feet can only take so much before the soul starts to leak out through the cracks in his skin." For Bento, every step through the brush of the Riberon woods was a jagged tooth biting into his flesh. Without his shoes, the forest floor wasn't just earth. It was a minefield of sharp flint, rotting thorns, and the cold, slick mud that tried to pull him down with every stride. His feet were a mess of red and black, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He knew that the moment he sat down, the cold would settle into his bones and he'd never get back up. But the physical pain wasn't the worst part. It was the silence. In the woods, silence is a lie. It means the birds are watching something you can't see. It means the wind is carrying a scent you haven't caught yet. Bento kept his hand pressed against the chest of that wool coat, feeling the hardness of the parchment beneath the fabric. That paper was heavier than the wool. It was the weight of every man and woman still back at Tres Barras, waiting for a miracle they didn't even know was possible. The problem was that the rain had stopped, and in its place a thick white mist was crawling off the river. It swallowed the trees, turning the world into a grey ghostland where directions didn't exist. Bento was losing his way. He needed to find the old charcoal burners trail that led to the village road, but the mist made every trunk look the same. He was walking in circles, and he knew it. Back at the big house, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. Donna Adelaide had stopped screaming. She was sitting at the mahogany dining table, a single candle burning in front of her. She was methodically going through a stack of her husband's private ledgers, ripping out pages and tossing them into a silver bowl to burn. She was trying to erase the debts, trying to hide the fact that the Porto do Ferro lands, the very land the warehouses sat on, weren't listed in the estate's assets. She realized now that the colonel had played a long game. He hadn't just gambled away his money. He had protected the most valuable parts of his legacy by putting them out of her reach. And he had given the key to a man she considered less than the dirt on her shoes. If you can't stand a lie dressed in silk, you should subscribe to the channel. And tell me, was this coat a gift to Bento or a death sentence for the widow's greed? Adelaide looked up as the door creaked open. It was Dr. Arana, the lawyer. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "The search party found a dead dog at the river," he whispered. "Bento crossed. He's on the village side now." Adelaide didn't blink. "Then send word to the village. Tell the local guards there's a thief on the loose. Tell them he stole the colonel's official seal and a bag of gold. I want him arrested before he can even see the roof of the courthouse. If he talks, make sure nobody believes a word from a runaway's mouth." But while the widow was spinning her web of lies, Bento was stumbling into a different kind of trap. He had reached a clearing near the old forge when a shadow stepped out from behind a massive cedar tree. Bento reached for a heavy branch, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the figure held up a hand. It was Tiburcio, the old blacksmith. He was a man made of iron and soot, his skin mapped with the scars of 1,000 sparks. He had worked at Tres Barras since he was a boy, and he was the only one who had seen the colonel's secret nighttime sewing sessions. "Don't run, Bento," Tiburcio said, his voice like gravel grinding together. "I've been tracking you since the river. Norberto's men took the high road thinking you'd go for the bridge further down. They're stupid, but they're fast." Bento leaned against a tree, his breath coming in wheezes. "Why are you here, Tiburcio? Did she send you?" The blacksmith spat into the mud. "She thinks she did. She told me to help the hunt because I know these woods. But I remember the colonel. I remember the night he called me to the big house to file down that brass button. He told me then. He said, 'Tiburcio, when the time comes, make sure the man in the coat gets a head start.'" Tiburcio reached into a burlap sack and pulled out a pair of thick leather work boots. They were old and smelled of grease, but to Bento they looked like gold. He also pulled out a small sharp knife and a piece of dried meat. "Put these on," Tiburcio ordered. "You got 6 miles to the village square, but you can't go through the valley. Norberto is waiting at the Widow's Pass. He's got 2 men with him and they're armed with muskets. He knows you have to pass there to get to the judge." Bento pulled the boots on, the relief of the leather against his shredded feet almost making him weep. "How do I get around him?" "You don't," Tiburcio said, his eyes dark. "The mist is your only friend now. But there's something you don't know, Bento. The judge, Mirel, he's in the big house tonight. Adelaide invited him for dinner to discuss the estate. She's trying to charm him before you can reach him. If you go to the village, you'll find an empty office and a dozen guards waiting to chain you up." Bento felt the world tilt. His only hope was the judge, and the judge was currently sitting at the widow's table, drinking her wine. "Then I don't go to the village," Bento said, his voice suddenly hard. "I go back to the house." Tiburcio stared at him. "That's suicide. The place is crawling with guards." "They're all looking for me in the woods," Bento said, clutching the coat. "If the judge is at the table, then that's where the truth needs to be told. The colonel didn't give me this coat to hide in a cave. He gave it to me to walk through the front door." But as Bento turned back toward the plantation, he didn't see the movement in the trees behind Tiburcio. He didn't see the glint of a musket barrel leveling through the mist. Norberto hadn't gone to the high road after all. He had stayed back, betting that someone would try to help the old man. The hammer clicked back, a small sound that felt like a thunderclap in the quiet forest. And just like that, the secret of the coat was 1 second away from being buried in the mud forever. The click of the hammer was the last thing Tiburcio heard before he threw his massive, soot-stained body into the brush. The musket roared, a deafening crack that shattered the silence of the mist and sent a lead ball whistling inches past Bento's ear. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder filled the air, thick and choking. Tiburcio hadn't just moved. He had lunged at Norberto, tackling the overseer just as the trigger was pulled. The two men tumbled into the mud, a chaotic mess of limbs and curses. "Run, Bento!" Tiburcio roared, his hands locked around Norberto's throat. "Get to the house, don't let him get the coat." Bento didn't hesitate. He didn't have the luxury of mercy or the time for gratitude. He turned and vanished into the grey wall of the mist, his new boots gripping the slippery earth. Behind him, he heard the sounds of a brutal struggle, the thud of a fist against bone, the guttural snarls of Norberto, and the shouting of the other guards as they closed in on the blacksmith. Tiburcio was buying him minutes with his own blood, and Bento knew those minutes were the most expensive gift he'd ever received. The problem was that the forest was now alive with the hunt. The gunshot had acted like a beacon. Bento could hear the whistles and the distant shouts of the men who had been searching the high road. They were converging on his position. He couldn't go back the way he came, and he couldn't stay on the trails. He had to move through the shadow path, a narrow, forgotten ravine that ran behind the old coffee kilns and led directly to the servants' entrance of the big house. As he ran, his heart hammered a rhythm of pure, cold adrenaline. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a vessel for the colonel's final act of defiance. He thought about Adelaide sitting in her fine silk, sipping wine with the judge while Tiburcio was being beaten in the mud. He thought about the manumission papers turning to ash in the fireplace. The indignity of it all burned hotter than the fire that had consumed his freedom. If you don't swallow these well-dressed lies, subscribe to the channel. This story isn't about a coat, it's about the price of the truth. And tell me, do you think the colonel was a good man for doing this, or just a man who wanted to watch his wife lose everything from the grave? Bento reached the edge of the plantation's inner circle. The big house loomed through the mist like a white tomb. Torches flickered on the front porch, and he could see the carriage of Judge Morels waiting near the steps. The house was guarded, but the guards were looking out toward the woods. They weren't expecting the prey to walk right into the lion's den. He crouched behind a stack of drying coffee crates, his breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. He could smell the roasting meat from the kitchen and hear the faint sound of a piano playing in the parlor. It was a scene of perfect, wealthy peace, built on a foundation of theft and broken promises. But as he watched, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Two men, strangers in city clothes, the creditors, were standing by the side entrance, talking to Dr. Arana. They were holding a stack of papers, and one of them was pointing toward the slave quarters. "We want the inventory finalized tonight," the taller man said, his voice carrying in the damp air. "The widow promised us 40 heads of prime labor to settle the first half of the debt. If the judge signs the transfer of the warehouse lands, we take the workers to the coast by morning." Bento gripped the wool of his coat so hard his knuckles turned white. Adelaide wasn't just selling the land, she was selling everyone. She was liquidating the lives of people who had known her since she was a bride, all to keep her mansion and her name. If Judge Morel signed those papers tonight, the deed inside Bento's coat wouldn't matter. The people would already be gone, sold into the brutal sugar mills of the north, where men didn't last a year. The turning point wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Bento realized he couldn't wait for the judge to leave. He couldn't wait for a quiet moment. He had to interrupt that dinner. He had to walk into that dining room covered in mud and blood and force the law to look at what it was protecting. He looked at the brass button on his chest. It felt warm, almost as if it were holding the heat of the colonel's dying breath. He didn't have a musket. He didn't have a whip. He just had a piece of parchment and a coat that everyone had laughed at. "The colonel knew your heart was smaller than this coat, madam," Bento whispered to himself, a phrase the old master had once said about his wife during a bitter argument. He stood up, stepping out from behind the crates. He didn't sneak. He didn't hide. He walked toward the back door of the kitchen, his shadow long and jagged against the white walls of the mansion. The cook, an old woman named Jovelina, saw him through the window. She dropped a ceramic plate, the sound of it shattering, echoing like a signal. Bento didn't stop. He pushed through the door, the heat of the ovens hitting him like a physical blow. The kitchen staff froze, their eyes wide as they saw the man they thought was halfway to the coast, standing in their midst, wearing the master's old wool coat. "Bento," Jovelina whispered, her voice trembling. "They're looking for you. Norberto said you killed a man." "I'm not here to kill," Bento said, his voice level and terrifyingly calm. "I'm here to collect an inheritance." He walked past them, moving toward the heavy oak doors that led to the main dining room. He could hear Adelaide's high, forced laughter coming from the other side. He could hear the clink of silver against porcelain. He reached the doors and placed his muddy hands on the polished wood. He knew that the moment he opened them, there was no going back. He would either be a free landowner or a dead man on the floor. He pushed. The doors swung open with a heavy thud, the sound echoing off the high ceilings and drowning out the soft piano music from the parlor. The smell of the wet forest, of mud and desperate sweat, flooded the room, clashing with the expensive scent of roasted duck and fine wine. Donna Adelaide froze, her silver fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated hatred. There stood Bento. He looked like a nightmare birthed from the Riberon swamp, covered in blood, his clothes torn, his face a mask of exhaustion and iron resolve. But it was the coat, the heavy dark wool draped over his shoulders, that drew every eye in the room. Judge Morel set his glass down slowly, his eyebrows arching in surprise. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but the sight of a field hand barging into a private dinner was enough to make anyone's blood run cold. Before anyone could speak, Adelaide found her voice, and it was like a whip cracking across the table. "Guards!" she shrieked, standing so abruptly her chair toppled onto the rug. "Arrest this animal. He's a thief. He's the one I told you about, Judge, the man who attacked my overseer and stole my husband's belongings." Two guards who had been stationed in the hallway rushed in, grabbing Bento by the arms. They were strong men, used to breaking spirits, and they slammed him against the edge of the mahogany table. A crystal vase tipped over, spilling water across the judge's lap, but the old man didn't move. He was staring at Bento's eyes. He didn't see a thief. He saw a man who had come to deliver a message from the dead. The problem was, the guards weren't just trying to hold him, they were trying to drag him out into the night where they could finish what Norberto had started. Adelaide was frantic, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the door. She knew that every second Bento spent in that room was a second where her world could catch fire. "Get him out!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Kill him if he resists. He's dangerous." But Bento didn't struggle, he didn't shout. He looked directly at the judge, his voice low and steady, cutting through Adelaide's hysteria like a knife through silk. "The law doesn't just belong to the people in the big house, Your Honor," Bento said. "The colonel knew you were a man who valued a signature more than a name. He left me more than a coat. He left me a truth you haven't seen yet." Judge Morels raised a hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of the empire. "Wait," he commanded, his voice quiet but absolute. The guards hesitated, their grip loosening just enough. The judge leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the brass button on Bento's chest, the one with the jagged scratch. He remembered seeing that same mark on a seal in the colonel's office weeks ago. That's when the air in the room seemed to vanish. Adelaide's face turned a ghostly, translucent white. She realized the judge wasn't looking at the mud, he was looking at the inheritance. "What truth, Bento?" the judge asked. Bento reached for the button. "The truth about who really owns the ground under this table." Bento's thumb pressed hard against the scratched brass button. He pushed in, twisted it to the left, and a sharp metallic click cut through the tension in the dining room. The hidden seam in the coat's lining didn't just open. It spilled the truth onto the mahogany table. The parchment landed with a heavy thud right next to the judge's wine glass. Adelaide lunged forward, her fingernails clawing at the air. But the guards, seeing the judge's expression change, pulled her back. She wasn't the mistress of the house anymore. She was a woman whose lies had just run out of breath. The judge picked up the paper, his eyes moving rapidly over the imperial seal and the colonel's jagged signature. The room went so silent you could hear the wax dripping from the silver candelabras. "This is a registered deed," Mireles whispered, his voice flat and final. "Signed and notarized in the capital 6 months ago, the Porto do Ferro lands, the warehouses, the docks, and every foot of the river access belong entirely to Bento." The creditors standing by the door didn't wait for an explanation. They turned on Adelaide like wolves on a wounded calf. If the land wasn't hers, the contracts she had signed were fraud. Her debts were no longer protected by the plantation's assets. They began shouting for their money, their voices drowning out Adelaide's weak, stuttering protests. She fell back into her chair, her silk dress soaked in spilled wine. She looked smaller and more ragged than the coat she had mocked that morning. Bento didn't look at her with a smile. He didn't need to. He looked at the judge and pointed to the inventory list Adelaide had been preparing for the creditors. "I don't want the gold from the warehouses," Bento said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I want the people. Every man and woman on that list goes free tonight, or those warehouse doors stay locked until the coffee rots in the bags." The judge looked at the deed, then at the broken widow, and finally at the man standing in the mud-stained wool. He took a pen and signed the release orders right there on the dinner table, using the same ink Adelaide had planned to use for their sale. Subscribe. Here we pull up what they tried to bury. And comment. Do you think someone there knew everything? Or did everyone just choose to pretend? The colonel hadn't left Bento a rag. He had left him a trap for a woman who thought she could own a man's soul. He knew that greed blinds the eye to the value of small things. Adelaide was left with an empty mansion and a life of debt, while Bento walked out the front door, the heavy coat still on his shoulders, leading 40 people toward a dawn that finally belonged to them. The truth wasn't in the gold, but in the thread of an old man's revenge.